Hi, thanks for joining me once again for Life Stories as we look through the Bible together in the middle of the week to gain some encouragement from Bible figures and characters and the Old and New Testaments. Back to the Old Testament today. And we're going to talk about a man who I've called a man of simple greatness. And he's actually got a name you won't recognize, but perhaps you'll recognize his story when I open it up to you. Let me begin by asking you, as a Christian, do you feel that some of your gifting is pretty quiet? You're not an upfront gifted person. You're not a leader in the church or in your home group. You're quieter. You've got a quieter gift, a gift of perhaps serving or showing mercy, things like that. And sometimes when we have gifting like that, we think that we are not contributing to the big purposes of God. We're doing something hidden and too simple and too quiet. But when in reality, everything you do for the Lord, if He's in it, beloved, is a big thing. And in certain senses, you never know how far your simple gift of obedience will affect people. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a virtual unknown in Scripture. He's only mentioned in a couple of chapters in the Old Testament. His name is probably unknown to you, but he was given an impossible task, but it had big consequences because it involved the continuation of the physical line of Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah, through the line of Abraham. So it was a very important task with impossible details that was given to a quiet and hidden man. The man's name was Eliezer, Eliezer in our English. And he was a servant of Abraham. Interestingly enough, his name means God is my help. And for the greatest episode of his life, he achieved success precisely because he didn't know what to do. He came up with the best idea he could, and he said, Lord, bless my idea. Come and help me. And that's exactly what happened. So it's a great story. As always, let me talk to you about three things. The person a little bit that we're talking about, give you a little background on him. And then I'll take a short passage from the Word that illustrates or highlights their great quality, or sometimes their great weakness. And then finally, we'll take a principle, put it into words that we can use as a walkable principle even this week. So Eliezer, what about him as a person? Well, like I said, he was a servant of Abraham, and we know who Abraham was. He was the man who received the promises to start the great people known as the Jewish people and the nation of Israel, and to begin the physical lineage of the Messiah, Jesus, through the Jewish nation. And God called him out of Mesopotamia, and that area of ancient Mesopotamia in yesteryear, and he brought him out to head to modern day Israel, the promised land. And he was to have a son, but then God allowed Abraham and his wife Sarah not to be able to conceive for decade after decade after decade. And so they just didn't know how God was going to keep his promise until, by miracle, when Abraham was 100 and Sarah was 90, they conceived together and had a son named Isaac. And we've talked about him in our times together. Now, Isaac grew to a certain age where he needed to marry, and Abraham confronted another impossible situation. Not only was the birth of Isaac difficult, nigh on impossible physically, but finding a wife for Isaac was very difficult because Abraham didn't want to choose a wife for Isaac from among the pagan tribes that were around him where he was as a stranger in Canaan. And he wanted to go and get a wife for Isaac from his own people, Abraham and Isaac's own people, who were living back in Mesopotamia, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. So Abraham called his servant Eliezer to him. Now his name may be familiar because he may be the individual that Abraham was originally going to make his heir. Back in Genesis 15, Abraham called out to God and said, if you're not going to give me a son, let me make Eliezer, my servant, my heir. And God said, no, I'm not doing it the human way. I'm doing it the supernatural way. But we think Eliezer there is the same guy in Genesis 24 that we're talking about, which means he was the most prized servant that Abraham had. And so a person of real quality, even though he lived behind the scenes. So Abraham goes to his go-to guy, Eliezer, and he gives him some instructions. He says, I want you to go and take supplies and saddle a number of camels and I want you to take that long journey of many hundreds of miles back to Mesopotamia, back to where my family came from. And I want you to find a wife for my son Isaac. And I want it to be from someone who is from our family, not our family tree so much as just our family circle is a better way to put it. Now, Eliezer had no idea how to do this. He'd probably never been there, and he had no connections there and didn't know quite what to do, but Abraham sent him on his way. And Eliezer takes this little caravan of his, and he goes to Mesopotamia. Now, this is all recorded in Genesis 24, by the way, which we'll get to in a minute. So on the way, Eliezer prays to God and asks for God to give him a plan. How am I going to even find a person that's related to the family, let alone the right person for Isaac? I think Eliezer loved Isaac almost as a son himself. And so he comes up with this plan that he'll stop at a well outside of a town that he knew was related to Abraham's family. There were people of Abraham's family in that town, but many, many other people as well. And so he was going to stop his little camel caravan outside the walls of that city, and he was going to sit at the well at evening when women would come out and draw water from the well to take it back for the evening dinner and for getting through the night. And he said, God, if I sit out here, the first woman that comes up to me, I'm going to say, will you give me a drink of water? And then when she brings me the water, I'm going to say, will you also bring water for all my camels? Pretty big request. If you don't know, camels, they drink a continent full of water to just go on their way. That's a huge task. Bucket after bucket after a bucket would be required. And so this woman would have to have a willing servant's heart. But that's what Eliezer said. I'm going to know that she's the right person if she not only gives me water, a stranger, but she waters all my camels. And then he said, I will know that that's the one I'm supposed to bring to Isaac. Well, he sits out there at the well, and sure enough, along about evening time, a young woman comes up from the town, and her name is Rebecca. She comes out, and he asks her for a drink of water, I believe, in Genesis 24, and she more than willingly does that. And then before the words come out of Eliezer's mouth, Rebecca volunteers and she says, as I bring you this water, please do me the honor of letting me give you water for all of your camels. So she volunteered it without even having to be asked. And she goes and bucket after bucket, pulling it up from the depths of that well, carrying it on her shoulder, pouring it into a trough for the camels over and over and over and over again as Eliezer is sitting there amazed at how God was answering his prayer. So she finishes watering the animals, and Eliezer is standing there looking at her, and he says, what is your name? And she says, Rebecca, and he asks, what family are you with? And it turns out, miracle of miracles, that she's one of the people in that city who was directly related to Abraham's relatives. So Eliezer knew the Lord was all over this. So he sends Rebecca home. She comes back and invites him back to the house. He's welcomed in. And in short order, if you read Genesis 24, Eliezer talks about this marriage proposal, and the family sends her with their blessing hundreds of miles away back to Abraham and back to meet Isaac, so that the family line of the Jewish nation would continue and Jesus, Yeshua the Messiah, centuries later would be born. Now, that's the whole story of the person of Isaac. The person of Eliezer and how he relates to Isaac. So let me go secondly here to the passage. There's plenty of things to read about in Genesis 24. The whole chapter is the story of this living miracle. But I'm just reading you the end as Eliezer comes back to Abraham's camp after finding Rebekah and taking her from her relatives and making these hundreds of miles go behind them. He comes to the edge of the camp. And in Genesis 24, it says, he comes to the edge of the camp, and Isaac sees them coming in the distance, because he'd gone out to meditate in the field toward evening. And he lifted up his eyes, Isaac did, young, lonely, single Isaac. And he saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes. She was perhaps riding on the back of one. And when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel in respect and in anticipation. I just think that's phenomenal. And then she turned and said to the servant, Eliezer, Who is that man walking in the field to meet us? And the servant said, It is my master. In other words, it's the young man that I'm bringing you back to marry. She took her veil and covered herself. And then Isaac, it says in verse 67, brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife. And listen to this, and he loved her and was comforted. So it's the beginning of a beautiful human love story that was really part of God's great love story to bring a Savior through Israel for you. And it all happened because a virtually unknown guy took on a virtually impossible task. He asked God for an idea about how to do it, and God came through in a miracle. But none of this would have happened on the human side. Listen, if Eliezer, the servant, hadn't stepped up and followed through on everything he said. My favorite verse about him is verse 66. And the servant, Eliezer, told Isaac all the things that he had done. He brought Isaac in on all of it. And Isaac, too, could rejoice in the miracle of how God had led and provided for him. You know, to me, that's a vision of what we're going to do when we get to heaven. Except we won't be telling Isaac, although we'll see him there, we'll be telling Jesus. And we shall stand at the gate of heaven and tell him all the things that we have done for him. And how even in small things we made a big difference. And that's how I would put this into a principle today for you. Listen up. I wrote it out this way. Eliezer's story shows me that even the simplest service can be the greatest service if God is in it. Even the simplest act, the simplest way of serving God can be a great thing if God is in it. And we certainly saw that God was in this. How many things is he involved with in your life? In your simple obedience to him, in your marriage, as a son or daughter to your parents, in a ministry situation in your church, however humble it might be, as a prayer warrior, as someone who has a sick relative, and how you can minister the love of Jesus. The list can go on and on and on, but only you can complete the sentence and say at the end of it all, Lord, this is what I have done. May the Lord bless your obedience this week until we check in again next time.